PTFE classified as PFOS? In what use will PTFA be regulated?
Um, PTFE is in fact a PFAS. It is considered a PFAS, and it's actually the compound that's most commonly used in, say, firefighting foams and fire protection equipment. And so that's something that needs to be addressed because that's one of the ones that's being targeted. Now, PTFA, as far as how that's going to be addressed, it's hard to say. Um, you know, we see the general PFAS bans, which will cover all PFAS compounds. So the EU ban, I believe both of those substances would be subject to the TSCA 887 reporting. Those substances would be subject to reporting under Maine and Minnesota. And the substances would definitely be, restricted from Maine, Minnesota, and EU unless you can get the relevant authorities to identify their specific use in your product as an essential use.
Okay. We are an end user and we buy a part from a distributor. Is my company or my customer obligated to inquire about PFAS status as we are not a direct importer per the EPA?
Per EPA TSCA Section 887, it applies to people who have imported articles. So if you're not the importer, then you wouldn't be subject to the TSCA reporting. Your importer would. So if you're buying from a distributor, then that distributor, if they're importing directly, then they would be the one subject to that reporting. And if they're buying from an importer, which is likely, then it would be that importer that would be subject to the reporting themselves. So it's whoever imports the item. So as a downstream user, you would be out of scope for the TSCA 887 reporting.
Okay. Do we already know when the European Chemicals Agency will provide feedback on the comments from the public consultation?
We don't, unfortunately. Ideally, they would come back relatively quickly, like maybe in a 6-month time frame. So we would be expecting it now. But considering the fact that they had 5,600 comments, it's going to take them some time. They don't have an unlimited staff there, and so they have to do their due diligence. So I would expect, based on a number of comments, that it will take some time. We may not even see anything come out this year, although it might be the end of the year. So we can only kind of take a guess. They haven't provided any feedback into when they're going to be able to give us a response to the comment period. We're hoping to get more information out of them this year, but it may run into 2025 before we see any updates from them on that.
Okay. How many PFAS/PFOS compounds are identified in the PFAS family?
Well, basically all the PFOS compounds are technically in scope. Now, there are some PFOS related compounds that may not be identified as PFAS. And again, that depends on what definition you're operating under. So anything with a fluorinated carbon atom, if you're using that definition, then basically all PFOS would be in scope. If you start looking at the structural definition under, EPA, then you would have to look at the individual compounds to see. Now, it's hard to say because when you're talking about a PFOS and its salts kind of thing, you're talking about, man-made chemicals. So you say, well, there's this many known chemicals that, meet the structural definition, but that's really hard to say because you may not know all the chemicals out there. But I would say you should just consider all PFOS to be in scope for PFAS restrictions.
Okay. If we do not import, but we use a PFAS product that is made in the US, do we need to report?
No, you do not. Not under TSA Section 887. It applies to the manufacture of raw PFAS. It applies to the import of raw PFAS, and it applies to the import of articles which contain PFAS. So the idea being is they want to know what PFAS is being produced and used in the United States. So once it's reported by the producer, then it doesn't need to be re-reported by the user. So that's the context anyway. So if you're using a product that already contains PFAS in it that you did not produce or import, then you have no obligation to report under Section 887.
Okay. Are the date ranges for Maine similar to the EPA TSCA, or are they only requesting data for the current year?
Maine and Minnesota is only requesting that you provide data on information and data on products that you're placing on the market. So in other words, if you want to put your product on the market and sell it in Maine and it contains PFAS, you need to make a notification. There is no historical data requirements for the Maine or Minnesota requirements.
Would labeling be included in PFOS reporting in the US if labeling is not the end product bought by the consumer?
If you are importing labels from outside the United States and those labels contain PFAS, then you would be subject to the TSCA Section 8A7 requirement because you're importing articles that contain PFAS. However, if you are using those labels on packaging, they would be exempt from reporting under Maine. If you have a label on your product that contains PFAS, then it would be reportable under Maine and Minnesota both. So again, the scope kind of varies depending on the application of the label, but the label is an article, so it would be subject to TSCA reporting if it is imported on its own or on a product. And it would definitely be reportable under Minnesota, and it would be reportable under Maine if it's incorporated into a product. But if it was sold as, if it was on packaging, it would be considered packaging and exempt under Maine.
The main requirement talks about intentionally adding PFOS. Since our supplier adds the PFOS into the component prior to us importing our product into Maine, can we make the argument that we are not intentionally adding PFOS and get our products exempted?
No, the idea of intentionally added is compared to naturally occurring, basically. So if that PFAS was intentionally added to your product anywhere in the supply chain, then it becomes reportable under Maine and Minnesota. When they say intentionally added, what they're meaning is that if you have some kind of naturally occurring levels of PFAS compounds that are present, or some trace elements that are unintentionally incorporated as a result of maybe a manufacturing process, then those would not need to be disclosed. But if you're intentionally adding PFAS at any stage in the manufacturing process, even if it's by your suppliers for some kind of purpose like flame retardancy or anti-corrosion or polymer stabilization or colorants, then you would definitely need to disclose that you would be in scope.
Okay. If you don't have PFOS in your products, do you have to send any documents stating that for any of the upcoming reporting requirements in Maine, Minnesota, or to the EPA?
No, you do not. You do not have to make a report to the EPA if you've imported articles that contain no PFAS. You only have to make the report if you do. The same is true with Maine and Minnesota. If you are selling a product with PFAS and you're required to make a submission to the database, there is no concept of making a negative submission saying I'm selling my product and it contains no PFAS. You would be exempt from the requirements altogether if you don't have PFAS present.
What is our option if suppliers don't have PFOS information and cannot provide FMD information?
Well, that's a big challenge. So this is where we have to push on the supply chain, right? Because under TSCA, we saw that it's to the end, we have to report information that's reasonably ascertainable. So if we can show we did our due diligence and try to collect that information and it's not available in the supply chain, then that's good enough to meet the TSCA requirements. But when it comes to Maine and Minnesota, there's an expectation that we know that we're placing products on the market that contain PFAS. So if our suppliers aren't able to provide that, then we need to push on them to do so or find new suppliers. If they if they're unable to do so, we could do things like perform some engineering analysis or risk analysis. For example, I can look at a material and determine whether I think that fluorinated compounds would have been added to that based on currently available engineering or industry data. I could go ahead and I could have testing performed if I needed to do so, but there is no kind of exemption at the legislative level that says, well, if your suppliers don't know if it's there, you're off the hook. So we do have to put our due diligence in and doing everything we can to determine where the PFAS is present. And suppliers who can't, provide that information need to be put on notice because these requirements aren't going anywhere, right? You can't just put your head in the sand and say, well, I don't know, so therefore I'm not going to be able to disclose, because those kind of suppliers are going to go away. they're not going to be able to be used in the supply chain, and they're going to be phased out. So suppliers that don't have this information need to start working on getting it. And the more pressure we can put on them now to start working on that, the less of a problem that's going to be as these requirements start piling up on us.
All right, I'm going to combine these two questions. Is there a threshold for reporting? And another similar question, what concentration ranges do we have to report in the US?
There is no specific threshold for reporting. If it's intentionally added that you need to disclose, it's there. Now, the ranges I haven't, they still working on the database in the state level, so I'm not sure. Now, there are ranges defined in the TSCA legislation as far as, the percentage present. I don't know what those ranges are off the top of my head, but you can follow you can take a look at the Code of Federal Regulations reference that I put in here, and it's in the legislation as far as what the range reporting is.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions here about scope. So we have some people asking if industrial products are covered, if medical products are covered, batteries, and packaging.
Okay, well, it's kind of a wide net to cast there because every regulation scope is a little differently. But looking at TSCA requirements, we have to keep in mind that TSCA has an exemption for medical devices, that if something is controlled by FDA, then it's not subject to TSCA reporting. So that is something that we need to be aware of there. So medical devices would probably, as long as they're regulated by FDA, they exempt from the TSCA requirements. However, there is no such medical device exemption in Maine or Minnesota. There would be no such exemption, I don't think, for the EU ban, but that could be something that comes out of those comment periods. So we don't know, right? So the answer is kind of for medical devices is kind of depends in the US on what kind of medical device it is, or if it's regulated by FDA or not. But for TSCA, but would be in scope for Maine and Minnesota. Industrial equipment, yes, in scope. Absolutely. And what were the other categories?
Industrial, medical, car batteries, and packaging.
Car batteries and packaging. So we've already identified that packaging is out of scope for the main requirement, but in scope for Minnesota. It would be in scope for TSCA 8A7 if the packaging is imported as articles into the US. As far as the European requirements go, again, the EU ban is going to be, the scope is unknown at this time, but as it's written, those things would be in scope. As far as, the individual substances restricted in the EU today, the scope applies based on the regulation. For example, we know what products are exempt or not exempt from REACH or from persistent organic pollutants, which is on a substance by substance basis on persistent organic pollutants on what's exempt and what's not. So we'd have to refer to those regulations to figure out if the individual item is exempt or not from the requirements. But overall, there is no kind of sweeping exemptions for these kind of things for, car batteries, things like that I've seen, related to, if I'm going to sell a car battery in Maine or Minnesota, there's nothing in the legislation that says car batteries are exempt.
Gathering data since 2011 is challenging. How are we supposed to address this? Any recommendations?
Yeah, that is challenging. The first step would be to go back into your logistical records and see what you have as far as records of what you've imported. Now, keep in mind that this is for imported articles, so it's the items that you've imported, not items you've less necessarily purchased from distributors. That makes it an even bigger challenge, right? Because hey, 10 years ago when I was building my products, I was sourcing components from who knows where, right? Was I importing those directly from China? Was I buying those from a distributor in the US? It's really hard to say. So go back. This first step would be go back through the logistical records and see what you have as far as what you purchased and from whom. That would be the first step. Next step is then to contact those suppliers and see what information they can provide. Now, EPA has acknowledged that it's a tall order to go back to 2011 and try to get this information, which is why they put right into the legislation that the expectation is you provide whatever is reasonably ascertainable. They don't expect you to, be able to provide 100% data going all the way back to 2011. But if you're able to find that information out, hey, I did import these particular items. We know they had PFAS. This is the amount. Then they want you to let them know, right? So it is a challenge, and that's why we recommend starting to pull your supply chain now. Try to figure out what information they have available. Put them on notice so they can start doing their tracing. They can start going back through their supply chain, figuring out the materials they used. They may not be able to give you back to 2011, but maybe they can give you back to 2019. Whatever they can get you back to, that's what you need to get, right? So the idea is that you're performing as much due diligence as you can. Can I make some kind of, there's no silver bullet to this, unfortunately. I can't really make a recommendation of, hey, just, go ahead and follow A, B, and C and you're done. No, it's going to be different for everybody. Everybody has a different supply chain. Everybody has different products. But the key is try to identify what data you think you can get and go after that data.
Excellent. Okay, last question. In terms of the PFAS lists for all these regulations, are Minnesota and Maine using their own lists, or are they using the EPA 8A7 list?
Well, because the requirements themselves don't point to a specific list, they just have a structural definition. Maine and Minnesota are using the most generic definition, which is basically any fluorinated carbon atom constitutes PFAS. So they do reference the EPA's master inventory. They do reference that. They say, hey, you can look here, but they do also say that, hey, that is not all inclusive. That if you have a PFAS present that's not on an EPA reference list, you still need to report that to us. EPA even says that, hey, we may not be aware of every PFAS in the world. So if you have something meets the definition of this requirement, you need to report it, even if it's not on the list. So those lists really are only provided as reference lists. So while Maine and Minnesota do reference the EPA's master inventory, right? They, really, ideally what you should be doing is kind of looking at all sources and creating your own superset, if you will, of all known PFAS. Or if you can figure out which PFAS are likely to be present in your products, you could focus on those. Like if I was making firefighting protection equipment, then I would obviously be seeking out PTFE because that's typically what's used. I would identify the compounds at high risk and go after those first, and then say, by the way, do you have any of these others, right? So that I can quantify those risks. So the answer to that question is that they are referencing the EPA's master inventory, but don't consider that an all-inclusive list to them because they don't.
Watch the full-length video and gain access to our full archive of educational webinars at greensofttech.com/videos. And while you're there, learn about our premier solutions for environmental regulation compliance.